Today, Sylvie and I are in the village of Fulbourn, which lies about 5 miles to the east of the city of Cambridge. Apparently the name Fulbourn comes from the Anglo-Saxon Fulbourn, which means a stream frequented by birds. The windmill, situated on a hill overlooking the village, was built in 1908. It was struck by lightning in 1933, and a storm in 1936 put it out of action completely. For 7 centuries, the village had 2 parish churches standing side by side in the same churchyard. One was All Saints and the other was St Vigor's. However, in 1766 the tower of All Saints collapsed into the church, and the church was never rebuilt. Sylvie and I are starting our walk from outside Fulbourn Manor House. From here we turn right onto Church Lane. Church Lane runs for just a few hundred yards before the road bends to the left and becomes Station Road. Station Road runs northwards for about 1/4 mile, and once we're over the railway level crossing, we're almost out of the village. The road then bends to the right and becomes Wilbraham Road. We walk along Wilbraham Road just for a couple of 100 yards before we come to a footpath on the left hand side. We go through the gate and along the footpath, which goes for about 1/2 mile across meadows and arable land. The footpath eventually brings us to a place called Hawkmill Farm, but we're going to take a slight detour to the left into this wooded area, which is a nature reserve. And judging by the notice board here, quite a lot of good bird sightings are to be made here. The reserve itself is basically a stream running through a wooded area, and with the temperature today at 29 degrees, it was a relief to get out of the baking sun. In the middle of the reserve is a small lake surrounded by trees, Unfortunately, there's a nice bench there, so we're going to sit here for a short while and eat our lunch and just watch the wildlife. Well, we saw and heard plenty of warblers around the reserve, but sadly not a great deal else. So it's time to carry on with the walk. We walked through the farmyard and then along a gravel driveway, and this takes us past the old windmill, which has now been converted into a nice posh house. Eventually we go through a gateway, and this brings us into the village of Little Wilbraham. Little Wilbraham was an independent village by 1086. It was also known as Little Wilbraham in the early 17th century. And in the mid 1800s and early 20th century, excavations unearthed over 300 Anglo-Saxon burials just outside the village. In the heart of the village is the village pub called the Hole in the Wall, which apparently got its name because there used to be a hole in the wall where farm workers could come up and fill their beer jugs. On a hot day like this, it's a welcome sight.
Cheers.
Oh, need this on a day like this. Well, on a day like this, we've got to sat there all day. But we've got a walk to get on with. So, half hour later, we're back on the road. We're heading down the road directly opposite the pub, and this is Church Road. And this eventually takes us out of the village towards our next destination, Great Wilbraham. Great Wilbraham seems to have been an important place throughout history. King Penda bestowed the land on his daughter Wilbur, and she in turn gave her name to the village, Wilbraham, which means Wilbur's homestead. But there's also evidence that the Romans were here long before then. Great Wilbraham is the quintessential English village. It's much larger than its neighbour Little Wilbraham, and it's full of charming old buildings and character cottages. And it's a lovely place to walk round at any time of the year. Sylvie and I are heading towards a part of the village known as Temple End, where there lies a big house called the Temple. This was originally owned in the Middle Ages by the Knights Templars, and after them it was the home of the Knights Hospitallers. In the 18th century it was bought by the Hicks family, who also owned all of the land around the village and employed most of the villagers on the land. During World War II, an airfield was constructed near the village, and this was RAF Bottisham. But here in Temple Park, apparently, tank regiments were based. Sylvie and I are now headed towards a part of the village known as Frog End, and it's here we take a footpath that takes us through somebody's driveway and eventually out of the village. Well, we now come out into open countryside, and the footpath now goes for a good couple of miles across vast open fields. Eventually, in the distance, we see this huge earthwork. This is known as the Fleam Dyke, and this runs for over 3 miles from near Fulbourn to near Bolsham. Apparently it was built by the Anglo-Saxons as a defensive ditch to keep out the Danes. There is a footpath that runs the entire length of the Fleam Dyke, and I've actually walked it myself. It's quite an enjoyable walk. But the footpath isn't maintained very well, and it's quite overgrown in areas. So if you ever fancy walking it yourself, I would not advise wearing shorts or thin leggings. You really need to cover your legs well to prevent them getting scratched to hell. Well, we're pretty much on the last leg of our walk today. After we leave the Fleam Dyke, we walk along this gravel trackway until we reach a hole in the hedge, and here the footpath takes us round some pasture fields towards some woodland. The footpath takes us for a short distance through some woodlands and eventually onto a narrow lane called Stonebridge Lane. After about a quarter of a mile, this brings us out near Fulbourn Manor, where we started the walk earlier in the day. Well, we hope you enjoyed this walk, and we'll see you next time.